Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. Hoping a couple more people will hop on here, but we'll go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone. I'm Katie Dieter, Event Marketing Manager here at 8Fig. Thank you so much for joining us today for our webinar, New Year, New Markets, What You Need to Know in 2023. We're happy to have 8Fig, AirWallex, and Z on today's webinar. Before we jump in, I want to give you guys background on each organization. First, we have 8Fig. 8Fig is a funding and planning platform that provides continuous capital to e-commerce sellers. So you get the funds that you need when you need them according to your supply chain plan, all optimized for an improved cash flow. Next, we have AirWallex. They simply help merchants go global. AirWallex simplifies global transactions in multiple currencies, all in one place. And then next we have Z. Z is an import and compliance partner for international expansion, assisting established e-commerce sellers looking to scale the globe with a premium, personalized, and efficient solution. But most importantly, we're here for the speakers. Our first speaker today is Emma from 8Fig. Emma has over a decade of experience growing and leading B2B tech marketing teams across multiple industries, from fintech to e-commerce. She currently leads 8Fig's US marketing team on our mission to enable every e-commerce seller to grow to 8 figures in order to achieve financial freedom, entrepreneurial success, or in her own words, whatever your heart desires. From AirWallex, we're joined by Curtis. Curtis is on the partnership team at AirWallex, building a network of partners focused on helping merchants expand internationally. In his spare time, he is consumed by his 4- and 6-year-old boys, but he does enjoy basketball, playing and watching whenever he gets the opportunity. And then last but not least, we have Bryce with Z. Bryce currently runs the partnership division at Z and has a strong background in strategy and finance. In addition to his professional pursuits, Bryce is a big sports fan, loves to play a variety of sports in his free time. He is also an avid lover of the African wilderness and enjoys spending time exploring the natural beauty of his home continent. Cool. So just a few housekeeping things before we get started. If you have any questions, during the event, please feel free to send them into the Q&A box or the chat, and we'll have time at the end, maybe 10 to 15 minutes to answer all of these questions live for you. So before we dive in, I do want to launch a poll. So you'll see that here in a second. If you want to go ahead and submit your answers now, I'll give you guys about 30 seconds or so. Just a few more seconds for the poll. Looks like we got one answer in, a couple answers in. Okay, let's see the results. So it looks like we have a few across the board, a lot of people looking to learn more information, so you came to the right place. All right, so we're gonna get it kicked off here with Curtis. I believe you're gonna get us started.
Yeah, welcome everyone to the webinar on e-commerce international expansion. I just want to say a few words and sort of set the table here. What we're finding is the e-commerce industry continues to grow at an unprecedented rate. Right? International expansion is becoming increasingly viable and exciting opportunity for merchants. As you see on the slide, there's a bunch of really interesting statistics and facts from a variety of sources, namely that it's projected to go to $4.9 trillion in 2023. And it's growing at a 15.6% year-over-year growth rate, right? So really, really steady, large numbers here to get your interest. So international expansion, right, can provide you with a potential for significant revenue growth. It also helps you to diversify your business, reduce dependence on the domestic market, and tap into new customer segments. However, while the opportunity is great, the process of international expansion can feel complex and daunting, right? Which is sort of why we're all here. So from navigating where to expand to figure out the best financing and shipping options, there's lots of challenges you sort of have to overcome, right, and get knowledgeable about. And our goal in this webinar is to really give you a solid understanding of what it takes to get you there, right? The knowledge and the resources to get your business global. And so throughout this discussion, we're going to be talking about your considerations for international expansion, some common misconceptions, shipping and freight considerations, and how to increase your margins as you expand, right? And we're, be sharing a little bit of case studies, success stories from e-commerce merchants who have done so. So sort of lead by example here. The chat's open, right? So we really encourage you to sort of ask questions along the way. Katie, our moderator, will nudge us. And we'll also leave time for some Q&A at the end in case we don't get time, to answer questions in the moment here. So, whether you're just starting out or you're a seasoned professional, we hope this webinar is informative and valuable to you. And thank you for joining. Let's get started.
Thank you, Curtis. All right, our first question is, what should sellers consider before expanding internationally? Awesome. I think, Emma, you're kicking us off with this one.
All right. Thanks, Katie. And thanks, Curtis, for the nice setup. But yeah, I mean, in terms of, it seems like most of the people here with us are kind of just exploring, might not necessarily know where they want to expand to next. So, I mean, there's a lot of basic things you can already start doing with free tools like Google Analytics, Google Trends, and just accessing your current traffic to your website and seeing, purchasing behavior. Are you getting, maybe there's a few countries that you're getting an uptick from, and that could be worth exploring and, seeing how you can go into those markets, as well as just like outside of your own website, just looking at Google Trends and seeing what searches are coming from where. And another aspect is, there's obviously a lot of other components in terms of making sure that you can support those different markets, like customer service wise, whether it's time zoned or the payments and the language. So obviously that's something to keep in mind as well. Like we've seen, there was a seller who was selling like, I think it was like baby swaddling items and, in the US, and then actually saw a ton of traffic coming from the Middle East. I guess, it was maybe more like a cultural thing and just like, having your baby swaddled. And it was really unexpected, but she then really leaned into that market. And for her, that, was a great indicator. So, I mean, sometimes you don't necessarily have that clear of a direction, but you can already start digging in with free tools and that sort of thing.
Cool. Thank you, Emma. I believe Curtis had some more to add to this.
Yeah, I mean, so one of the things you sort of need to consider, right, is like where you're going to go, right? To sort of echo onto Emma's point. And are you heading into a very competitive market, right? Like, so this is, a breakdown of if you're selling on, Amazon or selling on Shopify, and sort of where's all the competition basically, right? What percentage of the market represents that market for that marketplace? So as you can see, right, like maybe you're thinking about the UK because you're selling the US already, and it's natural because it's, English language and it's a Western culture and it all sort of fits, but it's also the second most competitive market for you for Amazon sales, right? Or third highest if it's Shopify, right? Or maybe you think about maybe never consider going to Japan, but Japan's actually the fourth biggest Amazon market, right? And it's actually like the APAC, Asian region, Australia regions are actually growing a bit faster than all the other markets, right? Because they're sort of a bit newer in this space. So those are some considerations you might want to think about. In addition to like, who's actually going to buy your stuff, if there's an interest and demand there that Emma said. And also, are you able to get like a small test off the ground, right? You don't have to like go in full throttle into the space, right? You can, sell into 4 or 5 different markets with, not so many units just to test it all out and make sure there's actually demand there before you actually commit to it, right? And I spent $1,000, but I learned from the $1,000 that I cannot sell in France, right? My product does not work in France for whatever reason, but in Italy it went like gangbusters, right? So just some things you want to consider, competition, market sizing, as you get going.
Cool. Thank you so much for that. All those great insights. Bryce, I believe you had some more to kind of chime in here.
Yeah, thanks, Katie. So I guess Curtis has presented a pretty interesting argument in terms of where the FBA sales are actually happening. But in this instance, we've assumed that you've chosen your markets to go into. At least you know which country you want to expand into next. So now what, I guess, is the question. But yeah, unfortunately, it's going to be a little bit of a non-sexy discussion with this slide, but I think sometimes the beauty is in the non-sexy aspects, especially when it comes to an e-commerce business. But I guess if we look at the tax and the import constraints, I think it's a very valid thing that a seller needs to think about when they're expanding. And I guess if we go into the example with a US-based e-commerce seller that's looking into the UK, for example, you need to ask yourself a question: are you going to store goods and locally fulfill using a 3PL or using an Amazon FBA center? If that's the case, you need to get yourself set up with a UK VAT registration, as well as a UK EORI number. The VAT registration allows you to store goods compliantly from a tax perspective, and the EORI number allows you to import compliantly and for the UK authorities to track your imports. In the EU, it's very similar. It's a question you need to ask yourself: are you again storing with a 3PL or using an Amazon FBA center? If that's the case, you need a local VAT registration in that country that you are storing in. You also need an EU EORI number. It's good to know that post-Brexit, UK and EU, it's not the same thing anymore, unfortunately. So you will need different EORI numbers. You will need different VAT registrations to sell in both of those markets. But if you are storing in one country in the EU, for instance, Netherlands, and you want to sell to customers across the EU, it's good to know that you'll need an OSS registration to do that, and that will allow you to remain compliant regardless of which countries you are selling into in the EU. And I think that is a fantastic way that the European Union have allowed sellers to expand into the EU, into every single country within the EU with ease. And you don't have to have VAT registrations in all those countries unless you're storing goods in all of those countries. I guess there's also the elements of the IOSS, which is the import one-stop shop. And that is for goods that reach below that 150 euro value, that intrinsic value. If you're moving goods across border or into the EU that are below 150 euros, then you can apply for an OSS registration and remain compliant through that one tax registration throughout the EU. And then I guess if you look at Canada and Australia, they operate very similarly. Both of them have GST, which is goods and services tax, and they both also are threshold based. So legally, you only are required to register for tax in those countries if you breach that threshold. However, it is worthwhile to register in any case. You can voluntarily register for tax for GST in those countries if you want to be able to reclaim that imports GST, which is possibly a sunk cost if you don't register. So we'd certainly recommend registering in that country. And then Japan is also a very interesting one. That is Japanese consumption tax, which is JCT for short, which is also threshold based, very similarly to Canada and Australia. And again, you don't have to register until you breach that threshold, but it is good in order to reclaim that import JCT. And then similarly to the UK and EU, an ACP number functions very similarly to that EORI number. You need it to be compliant for imports. And then I guess if we go on the product compliance side of things, some things that you need to think about just before you start importing into that first country is your testing, your labeling, and your representation specifically for your products. Now, you can think to yourself, I'm currently compliant in my country, my local country that I'm selling in, if you're a US-based seller, but there's a good chance it's not the same form of compliance that may be needed in the UK or the EU. So we need to think, what do I need in my country of import? It does depend on your product category. Food supplements are treated differently to electronics that are treated differently to clothing, for example. So it certainly does depend on your food, on your product category. But we do know that the UK and the EU are the most strict. So that is certain. For example, authorized reps is needed for food supplements and food products. When you talk about markings and labeling, generally when it comes to electronics, you need a CE or a CA marking on that electronic in the UK or in the EU. And your label has to be in that country, that local country's local language. That is a non-negotiable. For WEEE, that's specifically for electronics. That goes along with the Waste Electronic and Electrical Equipment Act. And that is something that you need to think about as well, especially within the EU. EPR packaging for green packaging within Germany is very, very strictly enforced these days. So looking at all these things, it's good to start that process sooner rather than later, because tax registrations can take months to come through. Likewise, with getting your products compliant can take months. Most recently, a case study that we had was a brand management agency that we are currently helping move from the US to the UK. They're selling food supplements. They're doing, I think, about 80 mil at the moment on Amazon US. They thought that their products would be okay in the UK because they're currently satisfying USA requirements, but that is actually not the case. There's quite a lot of authorized representation that's required for their products. Something as simple as prebiotic powder can be heavily enforced in the UK. So it's just good to know those laws before you start trading into that country. So last point of mine is don't delay that process, start it now. But yeah, that's all for me for this one.
Wow, thank you, Bryce. That was a lot of really great information. Does anybody have anything else they want to share on?
So Bryce, I actually, not to just throw a question at you, but to throw a question at you, because I'm curious, in terms of you saying not to delay. So is there like a typical time span that these kind of like registration processes take? Or I'm assuming it's probably wildly variable, but I'm just wondering if there's any like rule of thumb or people should be aware of, because it sounds very bureaucratic and potentially.
Yeah, it does depend on the country, because some countries are still stuck in the past, at least their tax authority is. UK, we've seen registrations come through in a month, but we've also seen registrations come through in about 3 months. So if you're looking to get into the UK tomorrow, it's a good chance you might have to wait. It does depend on the backlog. I know post-COVID, it did slow down the tax registrations coming through there. Netherlands, you can get it in 3 weeks. Germany, we've most recently got it in 3 weeks as well. So it really does depend on the country, but it also depends on your service provider and their relationship with the tax authority. Product compliance, anywhere from a month to 6 months, depending on the nature of your products. If you're good to go, generally, if you comply with the heaviest FDA regulations, you could be good to go. But say if you're a UK-based seller looking to go into the US and you want to comply with the FDA, wow, that can take over a year to get sorted. So that it honestly does depend, as you said, but I think it's good to have that investigation done and ask those questions before you start, or at least before you plan what month you want to get into that certain country.
100%. Yeah, I'm sure the FDA is not.
Yeah, they're a ball of fun.
Cool. Thanks, Emma, for throwing a question over to Bryce. I think we're moving on. Our next question, we have, what are some common misconceptions about expanding into new markets? I think we're going to let Bryce take this one away as well.
Yeah. I mean, I'm ready. My vocal cords are ready. I guess the first question is you don't need to do it all yourself. That's the first misconception. I think there's a big misconception that you need to have everything done in-house. You need to handle everything from A to Z. The great thing is the way that e-commerce is structured these days is that there's literally every single point of the supply chain, of points of a customer journey that can be outsourced. So theoretically, you could pay 10 people to run your business for you, all of them outsourced, all of them doing something different in the customer journey. And you could, I mean, technically, and I say technically very broadly, earn a passive income off the back of that. There are experts in the space that can help you in terms from consulting. There are videos, there are courses, there's certain companies that run A to Z product launches for you to literally replicate and follow yourself. So you do not need to do everything yourself. You have experts from funding, from payments, from logistics to compliance that have been in the industry for a while. So you certainly don't need to do everything yourself from that element. And then I guess from an entity setup perspective, do I need to set up an entity? That's a common misconception in the foreign markets. In my opinion, no, you don't. There are various models that you can use to get around setting up an entity, such as an import of record, a merchant of record, or even drop shipping into that country. Import of record, a quick explanation to what that is just a third-party importer that takes legal responsibility for your goods at customs, that allows you and gives you that foreign presence without having to set up a physical entity. A merchant of record basically buys the goods from you, and they become responsible for the taxes and the payments from the customer. So they take ownership of the goods, which is not all that great for control. And then we have drop shipping, which is just fulfilling straight from, say, the US to the UK. But that often presents a poor buying experience on the end customer, because often they are liable for the duties and taxes that are paid at the border. And then I guess the last misconception is that it is impossible. Got a great answer for you there. It is not impossible. You've got experts on the line like Emma, like Curtis, that can help you along the way. And I mean, technically, theoretically, again, I could run and start $1 million Amazon business from Joburg, where I'm currently in Johannesburg in South Africa, without ever having to step into the United States, just because of the infrastructure that's given to us these days. So it's certainly not impossible.
Well
Yeah,
said,
and
Bryce. Oh,
yeah,
no.
very well
You go
said.
ahead, Curtis.
No. I was just gonna add on, right? Like I completely agree, right? Like it's might be hard, it might be work, but it's not impossible, right? Like from our point of view, right? Like, like AirWallex, we're global, we have merchants all over the world. And a majority of them are like non-US based, and the US is their first market, right? So by default, they are going international on day one, right? And we see, 3-person teams doing $1 million a month because they have outsourced all the other stuff, right? They have outsourced the shipping and logistics. They have an accountant. They have the agency doing their ad optimization for them, right? So they don't actually have to do a lot of it. It's like, oh, a 3-person team doing millions of dollars a month in sales. And obviously, like, to what Bryce is saying, like, the industry is very robust now, right? There's a lot of vendors out there. There's a lot of partners out there. I'm sure everyone on this panel has, a Rolodex of partners that we could all reach out to ask questions, right? I just see it all the time from Bryce, right? Bryce is actually going on this on LinkedIn. He's like asking people questions like, hey, do you know anyone who can do X, Y, and Z? And like he gets like 30 comments of people replying saying, yeah, I know a guy who can do this sort of thing for you, right? So, starting a business is hard, right? I don't think that expanding internationally is any harder than what you've done already to date, right? Because the infrastructure is all there for you, regardless of like where you want to go or how you want to get there. Like, it's just sort of there and built for the taking if you want to do it, right? And if it makes sense for your product to go to this new market.
Yeah, outsourcing is the new black, right? Well, okay, sorry guys. But I actually had a question for both of you. So I've heard a lot, like, different arguments around getting an entity or not. So like I'd like to kind of hear the pros and cons. I think it sounds like there's just different routes you can take. So I would like to hear from you guys, like if they're like, I guess we kind of heard that you don't need to from Bryce. So maybe Curtis, if you had a thought about what the benefits might be of getting an entity. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, so the entity gives you a few different, benefits, right? One is depending on the market you're in and depending on where you're selling, right? If you need a payment processor, right? Someone who swipe your credit card, you really can't do that on like a WooCommerce, e-commerce site, right? Your own website, direct to consumer website. If you don't have entity set up, right? You're not gonna be like allowed to do so, basically, right? There's also potential tax benefits of doing this, right? And I know, like Bryce is saying, like, hey, they'll do it for you, but there's also, reasons you might want to do this yourself. And I actually have a pretty good example of this later on, where it's, if you're a US merchant on Shopify selling in the US, you're paying at, 2.5%, market rate for the processing fee. But if you sell from the US and you say, oh, I'm just going to go to the UK now, Shopify charges you like 3.8% or something like that for processing. And they also charge you an FX fee, right? But if you set up an entity as a business in the UK, you can just apply for a Shopify UK account. And I think the processing rate goes to like 1.5%, right? So you actually will get a cheaper rate to swipe the card if you are an entity in like the UK from Shopify versus not being an entity in the UK and just continuing on going forward. So there's like definitely pros and cons, right? I mean, I wouldn't recommend you doing this like right off the bat, but if the volumes are there, there are benefits to this for sure.
Yeah, they're certainly not going to lie. There are benefits, especially from the margin perspective that you showed. I mean, that's a live example. And I guess it's hard to argue with the facts from that Shopify perspective. But I guess Setting up an entity comes with admin because you're managing another company in that country. And the more markets you want to go into, the more entities you need to set up, the more admin that becomes. With entity setup, it comes annual maintenance costs. It comes a lack of flexibility, especially if you want to exit that market, then you're having to close that entity. And if that entity is running at a loss, it comes with, well, I mean, no one really wants to run a loss. But you also have to comply with the foreign employment laws, or in that country, I guess, the local employment laws, as well as the local tax that comes with the employment acts in that country. So, and if you don't comply with those, that comes with a suspension. So certainly from if you can get it right, if you're trading in, I'd say in that example, US to UK, no doubt there's a benefit to do it. No doubt. I think the more markets that you want to go into, the more complex it comes having to set up and manage those entities. But again, it depends on the size of the company. So yeah, definitely different arguments for that one.
Cool. Thank you, Bryce. We actually had a question regarding this question here. Is there anything else I can do to protect my brand / IP in international markets besides tax and import registrations?
I think from an IP perspective, I would certainly recommend trademarking a brand. I know there are tons of guys in e-commerce space that specialize in the legality that comes with launching into a new market from a trademark and copyright perspective. So I'd certainly say investigate doing that. Just comes a little bit different if you're naturally a reseller, because I don't think that would be possible. And yeah, from that's what I've got on that end. I don't know about Emma and Curtis.
I mean, yeah, this goes into like very, very much legalese, right? Like Bryce was saying, find a lawyer, basically, right? Is my answer. I am not a lawyer. I'm not going to pretend to be one, but they can help you with that, right? I think that's the best way to protect your brand in that space. Like I'm sure in our network, one of us will have someone who can recommend you that's an expert in this field. So if you want, you just ping one of us later, and we'll find you, sort of someone in our network that help you, right? Maybe Bryce will send a LinkedIn message on your behalf. So yeah, I think find a lawyer is the best answer to this, who can help you with branding, trademark, IP, right? And go through the ins and outs with this for you and the benefits for it.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone. Moving on, our next question we have, what shipping and freight considerations are important as I expand globally? I believe Emma, you're kicking us off.
All right. Yeah, I can jump right into this. So as we know, I would say the supply chain has not been very reliable. I don't think it was terribly reliable before the pandemic, especially post-pandemic, even further. In fact, I think I have a slide here if you want to just go to the next. Katie. But we've seen, so, I mean, also you have to consider inflation. So in terms of costs, like 71% of companies, and I think it was a Statistica survey, saw that the rise in costs of raw materials was actually their biggest supply chain threat. And the average shipping time from China has increased by 74 days. But then, of course, with the shift to, so many purchases online, consumers still say that, that demand is still there, and that's still causing a lot of kind of clogging in the ports and that sort of thing. So, just setting the stage and understanding kind of the challenges you're getting into. One point that we always like to, mention to our customers and people getting into the space is like, when you are expanding into a new market, you have new considerations of making a more proactive supply chain, making sure that you have multiple vendors available. But that the parts that, you're outsourcing, the freight, the shipping, the last mile, getting it to their door, that whole experience is still considered you, whether or not you're doing it. So if you have someone who screws up, you can't really go to your customer and say like, these guys kind of screwed up. Like, it's still your experience, like the whole end-to-end process. So really making sure that you can trust that, and that you have, like, when I say proactive supply chain, it means having multiple vendors and having multiple consideration of You know, some things are going to be cost more, but you'll get there faster. And maybe that's a promise you can make, is like, oh, we can do faster shipping, but then factoring that cost into the price as well. So, and when you're going into a new market, it's really important to look at who you already have. Like, I think that is something that, you know, a lot of people get the manufacturings in China or Southeast Asia. You know, maybe that's worth looking into some of the markets that are closer there. Because then all of a sudden, you know, other costs are significantly less. It's something that we always say as well, is really focusing on inventory management and planning. We typically, as a rule of thumb, we say plan for shipments 3 to 6 months in advance. And especially if you're looking at Q4, that could even be sooner, because we've had, you know, multiple clients who just, you know, if your Q4 is messed up, like your whole year is messed up. So really factoring in that extra time that we've been seeing in terms of getting what you need, as well as just making sure that you're always shopping around for better rates, and that you have multiple options if, you know, it's like air or, you know, whatever, so that if the ports get messed up, you have a plan B, plan C.
Yeah, I think, like, adding on to what Emma said, I think we've seen, especially in, I think, Q4 of last year, how Amazon loved their stock limits. And those stock limitations at this stage, it can cripple a supply chain and come with stock outs, come with inventory shortages, which is not good for ratings, which is not good for overall customer experience and rating on Amazon. So I'd certainly recommend, from a freight consideration, using a FBA prep provider if you're an Amazon seller. That allows you the flexibility as well as the cost effectiveness of shipping bulk into a FBA prep center and then drip feeding Amazon whenever they may need that stock replenishment. And then I guess another freight consideration is, should I use a freight forwarder or should I use a courier? I mean, Emma spoke about the blockage in China at the moment, and the rates coming out of China, especially. I mean, we saw it of Chinese New Year most recently. It was, don't try and get a quote out of China at that time, because it was ridiculously expensive. But a thing that you need to understand is, when it comes to courier versus freight forwarder, is, first of all, how heavy are my goods? Are they below 500 kilograms? Are they above 500 kilograms? Generally, if they're below, it's perfect for courier. If they're above, perfect for freight forwarder. And then we need to think about speed versus weight versus cost. The heavier it is, the more expensive, but also the more heavier it is, the more expensive it is for courier, but the cheaper it is for freight forwarder. But also, when it comes to using a freight forwarder, your goods will arrive a little bit later than a courier. Courier is obviously express, but you pay for that express. And then your different freight forwarding options, it's sea, road freight, or air freight. Generally, air freight is the quickest, but it's the most expensive. Sea freight is the cheapest, but it also can take up to 74 days to get your goods into that market. And then road freight is obviously the most convenient, and it's also quite cheap, but naturally you can't exactly do road freight from the US to the UK. The vehicle might get a bit wet. So that's obviously not a great example there. But I think planning in advance and shipping bulk is the best thing for your business. Bulk C is the most cost effective. I think you'll have great margins on your products then, but also using a freight network. Emma said having as many relationships as possible. I just want to emphasize that. Having a freight network at your disposal is of vital importance, just because you can have the ability to put a quote out, a shipment order out to that network, and often those freight forwarders will compete on price, and you'll get the best bang for your buck from that element. So definitely using a freight network to your advantage. But naturally, I think with freights, it all comes down to timelines. If you need it there in 3 days, courier is your best bet. If you've got 3 months to wait, then you save on margin and use a freight forwarder. But there's tons of things to consider. But that's, I mean, from my side, Katie, that's all.
I actually have a question for both of you. This is sort of like with the audience in mind, right? Who are just sort of like learning and starting out, and they might not be international, right? Given everything you've sort of said about like 3 to 6 months and shipping freight and logistics and timelines, how should people at least think about inventory planning in the very beginning, right? When demand might be variable, right? Like, in the US, they might know like we're doing $100,000 of sales. And now they're going to the new market. They're like, $10,000, $100, $1 million. Like, how does that, like, how do you guys sort of consider those options there?
I know, I'm pretty sure Braze probably has a very solid framework to approaching this as to many of these topics. But from my end, kind of like what we always suggest, which is also just kind of what we suggest for sellers during like an uncertain market, is really leaning into your hero product and starting there. It's, you might have some idea that, oh, maybe, this like secondary product you have could have more appeal in a different market, but we'd still really recommend just doubling down on, your most tried and true product, like one you've already seen success with, and use working from there, and then maybe experimenting afterwards. But just in terms of a general rule of thumb.
Yeah, and Emma, my points on that actually literally adds perfectly to yours, because using that hero product and then analyzing, there's various tools that you can use. I know Helium 10's got a great tool. I know Jungle Scout's got a great tool. Zonguru as well has a great tool for this. But it's finding a tool that showcases revenue and unit sales in a new market. So say, for instance, if you're looking to go into the UK, look at that, do that market analysis, see what your competitors are currently doing, or at least competing on product category. You might not know your exact brand competitors, but look at that product category, look at the median unit sales for that certain product. So if you're selling sneakers, look at that median competition. What does it look like? How many sales are they getting a month? And I guess that could be a good estimation if you're coming in at that middle range, what your product might be doing on a monthly basis, and then you can naturally plan your inventory around that. And that would be my recommendation for that.
Great. Thank you, everyone. So insightful. Lots of good information. Okay, moving on. Our next question: how can I increase my margins as I expand into new markets?
Yeah, so this is sort of what we were talking about a little bit earlier, right? With sort of the Shopify example. And this is very counterintuitive, right? Like you're thinking, I'm going to expand, my margins are going to be worse, I got to pay for all this other stuff. And so I have sort of two mock-ups here, right? Like if you're sort of like at a $10,000 or less range in sales per month, you're probably on a Shopify starter price. If you're doing 40,000, you're probably at advanced prices. This is like from Shopify's own website, right? They're saying, hey, if you're doing this much, you should be in this plan, right? And so if you're a US merchant selling internationally in the UK, right? Like I'm just going to go to the UK and sell, the processing fee for this, for your card swipe goes like 3.9, right? And by the way, they also charge you can't actually hold the currency because you don't have a UK bank account. So all the British pounds get converted immediately by Shopify at the 1.5% rate back into your US bank account, right? Because you're a US merchant. And so that's sort of like the running cost in that first column, right? But if you actually go to the UK and you incorporate as a business in the UK for like $100, right? Your processing fee actually drops because the interchange rate in the UK is much, much lower than the US, right? So you're at 2% now instead of 3.9% for processing. And oh, by the way, if you're using someone like an AirWallex or another virtual bank, or even like a physical bank in the UK, you can just hold the British pounds there, right? And if you're using AirWallex, you can convert at 0.4% above interbank, right? Instead of the 1.5% that Shopify is taking. And it just turns out that annual savings in the first year is like $3,500, right? $3,600. And obviously that's much more aggressive when you go to advanced prices, because you're doing more sales and you get a much lower processing rate and the whole deal. So counterintuitively, you actually will get better margins in the Shopify example here when you can incorporate in that market and sell like a local. And this is like just straight from their website, right? But just doing the analysis, like you're saying, okay, yeah, so $3,000 annual savings, that's pretty nice. But that's actually ends up being like probably close to like 10 or 12% of your margin, right? And gross margin of savings, right? Which is pretty nice at the end of the day.
Yeah, Curtis, I have a question for you. but it's more on the margins, right? The FX fees that are being charged. Are there certain countries that it is more affordable for customers to go into, regardless of if they are local or a foreign entity trading? I understand from a foreign perspective, it'll always be a little bit higher than a local. But are there certain markets that are just cheaper to go in from an FX perspective that is more, I guess, affordable?
Yeah, I think it really depends on where and how you're selling, right? To be honest, like for Shopify, you know, there's a few different things that sort of need to happen here. Let's use the Amazon example, right? And Amazon, like they're doing the processing for you. You don't get a say in that. And you know, if you don't have a local bank account, they'll just convert it for you, right, at their rate. So you're sort of taking on whatever rate they want to give you, which is, I think, is like 1 to 2.5%, right? It's just sort of variable for them. So it really depends on which market you're going to. I mean, I think it's always better, you know, and I am biased here, but to be able to have like a virtual bank account that can hold the currency indefinitely for you in the local currency. The reality is, like, if you're going to go, let's say, to the UK, right, you probably need someone to help you localize a little bit of your content, right? Even though it's English, there's nuances there. You don't want to use the wrong word because it might be slang for something else that, you know, might not be very nice, and all sort of fun stuff. So you'll probably be paying someone in that market to help you with the ad spend and the localized translation. So wouldn't it just be nicer to collect in British pounds and pay them in British pounds and not have any FX at all, right? Those sort of things I would think about there, right? But in any market, foreign market you're going into, if you don't sort of take the initiative to get like an extra bank account that's local, you're going to take on the FX fees that are imposed on you by the marketplace or by the suppliers, right, in the chain.
Yeah, and I guess margin is everything in the Amazon game, so can't be hurting yourself.
No, yeah, I mean, like, yeah, I mean, we literally just have a case study, and one of our customers sells like knives internationally, right? Like kitchen knives, you know, cutting knives and all that sort of stuff. And they were saying that Amazon takes like 2.5%. And just by switching over to us, they save like $40,000 a year, right? So like an absurd amount of money just from like just switching over, right? And just saying deposit money into this account versus our US account or whatever it would be.
Wonderful. Thank you, guys. I think, Bryce, did you have any more to elaborate?
Yes. So I mean, I said it a little bit earlier, but I think shipping bulk into a 3PL, whether it be a D2C 3PL or an Amazon FBA prep center, you're going to be saving on margins. I think any shipping provider, especially when you're going into foreign markets, they often get a lot more affordable the more you're shipping with them. So using a storage facility, especially, obviously it depends on the shelf life of the products, I think is of utmost importance. I mean, I had a chat with a customer today, actually, about the USA FBA prep providers that are available, because he was scared of Amazon stock limits. And his plan was to actually send lots of small shipments from China to the US. And when I mean small, I mean like in the tens of like items. And I was like, no, like that's going to be far too expensive for you. I mean, there's going to, and the crux also was that he was Canadian, so he didn't even have a US entity, so he would have needed to use an IOR. So I was just like, that's going to be far too expensive for you. He wasn't even aware of the FBA prep providers that are available to hold the stock and ship feed Amazon to like bypass this Amazon stock limit. So I definitely say look at that. From a tax deferment perspective, I think if you're going into the EU, there's certain countries where you don't actually have to pay import VAT straight away. You only pay import VAT when you start selling. So it's a reverse charge that's added onto your VAT filing. That is a great cash flow save. And it allows for freeing up liquidity, which I know 8fig are all for. So I'm sure they can also justify that as being a great example. Cash flow benefits is always ideal. And then from a VAT reclamation perspective, it's actually getting back that import VAT that you're paying in imports into the UK, into the EU, Australia, Canada, Japan. If you submit your documents at customs in such a way that you can reclaim your import VAT back, regardless of when it comes in a month, in 2 months, in 6 months, can take some time, but getting that VAT back is of vital importance, because it is a sunk cost if you don't, and it's a nice kind of Christmas present if you do, if it is like 6 months down the line. So I would definitely say make sure that you are stringent when it comes to that VAT reclamation as well as the tax deferments.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you so much. So we've hit our Q&A portion of the webinar. I see we have a few questions here in the Q&A box, so I'm going to run through them. The first one that we're going to answer is this one. I think, Curtis, you did touch on it a little bit, but if you just kind of want to elaborate a little more, the question is, we are a Canadian corporation who mostly sell in the US, and we use Shopify payments for payment processing. We want to switch our Shopify payments accounts from Canada to US based to take advantage of those lower payment processing fees for our customers. Do you know if we need to have a US company for this, or can we use our Canadian corporation and open a US based Shopify payment account? It was a mouthful, but I hope you got all of that.
No, I got it. Yeah, so this is the unique thing about like sort of a Shopify versus Amazon thing, where Amazon will let you sort of like sell in any market, you know, and collect sort of locally if you want to. Shopify actually requires that if you want to take advantage of a US Shopify account, right, you have to have a US entity, right? And this is why, like, to do Shopify in the UK, like, you have to get an entity, and that's why the benefits go to, like, if you just take that extra step to incorporate, right? And I think incorporation in the US isn't very high, right? It's like there's a lot of out service providers that do this for like a few $100, right? They'll incorporate with you, give your EIN number, give you all the paperwork you need, and then it's just a question of, like, you know, applying for, you know, a US Shopify account, and having, you know, a US bank account, plug AirWallex to like receive the USD funds, right? And then you can hold the USD funds and take advantage of all the lower rates. But yeah, you do need to incorporate for Shopify in almost every market to take advantage of the local Shopify, you know, regional rates.
Cool. Thank you so much. Hopefully that answered your question. I am going to go through the rest of these questions, but I am going to flip it to the last slide here so that everyone has a chance to scan the QR codes while we're answering some questions. So the next question we have, is it smart to expand on my own, or do you suggest I have a team behind me? How much would my workload increase? Anyone want to take it away?
I don't mind going for that there. I think we've dealt with people that, yeah, they've expanded by themselves, a one-man business, one-man band, but it can sometimes be challenging, especially if you want to do it all your own. So I mean, I guess that's why the experts exist. That's why there are outsourced service providers, especially on a point that we discussed very early on in the webinar, is that using the people that you have around you and businesses that you have around you to boost yourself to that success, to almost be a stepping stone and not have to do everything yourself. Naturally, I think many hands make light work, but I think it really does depend on the nature of your business, how much of your business you outsource. But I would always recommend that it's not the worst thing to have one or two people at your side to help.
Yeah, I mean, I also think, just to add on, like, depending on the product you're selling, the margin, right? Like, I mean, every, you know, add an agency for this, add a, you know, whatever for this, right? You know, whether it's an internal employee or an outsourced employee, right? It's all part of margin, how much you can sort of give away, right, to lessen your workload. But I guess it sort of depends on how much work you want to do too, right? If you want to, like, just, you know, go on vacation all the time, and this is like a side thing, and, you know, like, you know, for a real job and sort of thing, like, you know, normal 9-to-5 job, then you can just sort of outsource as much as you want, right? If this is your full-time job and your main passion point, and this is the thing you want to do, and you're still growing and building this, it might just be more work, right? But it just all sort of depends on your situation, I think.
Another point that I think we touched on a little bit earlier, but we didn't get too much into, is just also looking into taking advantage of marketplaces, especially Amazon. Like, if you're going from the US to the UK, you can get, you know, a UK account and then have access to other countries as well. And that's kind of like an expedited way of like a little bit of a safety net in terms of you're not fully committed. Obviously there's still multiple steps you have to take to doing that successfully. But I think if that is a route you wanted to take in terms of not sure if you wanted to fully outsource things and like bring in a team and like really double down into that, is just really taking advantage of those marketplaces. And say, like, Amazon has, like, we've seen people do that in a way that was pretty efficient and didn't involve bringing other people in. So that's also a great option.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone. It looks like we have 2 more questions, so we'll run through these last 2. How do I know if it's the right time to expand to a new market?
I think from our perspective, it's good to look at your local markets and see revenue-wise how you're doing, first of all, and unit sales-wise how you're doing. So, I mean, certain products won't thrive in certain markets depending on culture, depending on propensity to buy, spending patterns. But I think it's a good indication to see how your products are doing in your local market first. If they're doing well, there's no reason why you can't consider making a leap and trying to replicate that success. Or at least, I mean, if you're doing really well in the US market and you want to start in Germany, I think realistically, you're not going to get 100% of on return on that to like equal your revenue just because of how big the US market is. But if you can get 30% of that, I'd say that's a success. So I'd certainly say local market is a good indication.
Right. And yeah, so I mean, it sort of connects with the previous point Emma was making, right? Like Amazon makes this really easy. I mean, they will take their cut, right? But they make it very, very easy for you to say, oh, I want to just try a little bit in the UK. I want to ship a little bit to Germany and see how that goes. And I mean, and, you know, to all our points earlier, right? Like you can do these tests for very light costs, right? To make sure it's the right fit. But you know, without knowing a lot of other information, like I wouldn't recommend selling, you know, lawn care, you know, equipment into like the EU. That's not a thing out there, right? Or most markets actually, but yeah, you know, like I think you sort of know when you're in a good position in the US, right? Assuming you're in the US first, when you should start at least tinkering about it. And I assume you're thinking about it now since you're on this webinar.
That's interesting about lawn care. I didn't know that. But I actually had another point to add on as well is another variable is just cash flow. So looking at your own like infrastructure in terms of do you have enough cash upfront, you know, the goods that you need, factoring that time, you know, like 3 to 6 months. Like, I think there's just a lot of variables in that sense, in terms of you have a lot of moving pieces, a lot of items that, you know, you're putting that money up front, deposit, and then paying it at different times. Like there's a lot of different costs associated with just getting that batch of products. So making sure that you have what you need available at that time, and that we really recommend like just building a plan, even if it's just a spreadsheet or using anything. But that way you can really just visualize what money you're putting where and when you need certain things by, because there's just a lot of different dates to keep in mind for each batch. So obviously when you're pretty much building like a new supply chain, that's a whole new different, you know, type of dates to factor in. So I think just really making sure that you're sitting down and planning that out and making sure that you have the cash that you need.
Wonderful. Thanks, everyone. Our last question: are there any communities dedicated to expanding abroad that I could join or tap into?
I don't know any offhand personally, but like Facebook, Reddit, like, I mean, just the normal spots are ripe with these sort of things. Like these people, you know, everyone, like if you're sort of in this space, you sort of find each other, sort of thing. But there's a number of these sort of like communities out there, right? I don't know any of them offhand. I don't, you know, but I know they exist, right? Because our merchants and customers are all part of them. But I couldn't tell you offhand any of them personally. But maybe Emma and Bryce have a better answer than me. Sorry.
Yeah, Emma, I don't know if you want to go. I've got 2 off the top of my head that
Go
I could
ahead,
possibly.
Brian. Go for it.
And sorry about that. I just had a lovely blackout, which is standard in South Africa.
I saw that. I was not sure that
Yeah, it was quite exciting. Thank goodness I have a ring light. But in terms of net communities, I know of 2. One, well, we're partners of both of them, but the one I recently presented to, which is the AMZ Insiders community. I think it's Facebook. They've got about 20,000 members or so. It's got a good Instagram community, as well as the Titan network, which is, I think, a little bit more exclusive. But that I think you need to pay to get into. But it's also a fantastic network of $1 million+ Amazon sellers that are literally paired into groups on regular basis, for masterminds, for masterclasses, to just talk about how they run their businesses. So there are certainly many that you can access.
Yeah, also just going to physical events as well. I think the Amazon community especially just like loves it. We're going to be at Prosper, which is in March in Vegas soon. And then we also just have, there's quite a few thought leaders in the space. I mean, just generally like Liron Hirschkorn and Tomer Rabinovich. Sorry for butchering your guys' names. But we can send out a few links like in our follow-up with just places and people we'd recommend looking into.
Cool. That's a really good idea, Emma. Events is obviously really important to network and meet and learn. So thank you. Okay. So that is it for questions. Thank you everybody who submitted them in. So as you can see, we have these QR codes up on the screen. Feel free to scan those. I want to point out that AirWallex is offering 2% cash back on all card spend and up to a $500 sign-up bonus for those who attended this webinar. So it's a really great deal. You don't want to miss out on that opportunity. And then following the webinar, we'll send out this recording and any links that Emma just mentioned about maybe like some upcoming events or anything like that. So we really thank you all for joining us and we hope to see you again. Happy selling.
Happy selling.
Thank you guys for joining us, Emma, Curtis, Bryce. Appreciate your time.
Thanks, guys.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Have a great one.